Okay, we're going to move into a new area of philosophy now, an area entitled Epistemology, and this is going to be an introduction to epistemology in this lecture. Epistemology is spelled Epistemology. And now let me give you a definition of epistemology that will appear on your final exam. It's a very short definition. The definition is this: epistemology is the study of the nature of knowledge. So again, epistemology is the study of the nature of knowledge. Epistemology addresses all kinds of questions. It asks, what is the study of knowledge? Can we acquire knowledge? How do we acquire knowledge? What are the conditions, if any, for knowledge? What are the limits of knowledge? What relationship does knowledge have to belief, if any? What justifies a belief to make it knowledge? Is what justifies a belief external or internal to one's mind? And what relationship does knowledge have with truth? This and other questions as well are asked by epistemology. Now, epistemology is mostly concerned with the knowledge that something is the case, and not the knowledge how something is the case. For example, epistemology is more concerned with knowing that 4 times 5 equals 20, and not how to multiply numbers. Now, traditionally, epistemology recognizes 2 types of knowledge. The first one is called a priori knowledge. And that's, a priori is 2 words. The first word is a, and the second word is Priori. So write that down, a priori knowledge. Now let me give you a definition of a priori knowledge that will appear on your final exam. A priori knowledge is knowledge that is acquired prior to and independent of any experience, and only requires the use of reason to acquire it. So again, a priori knowledge is knowledge that is acquired prior to and independent of any experience, and only requires the use of reason to acquire it. It's also called sometimes innate knowledge, and we'll talk about innate knowledge later. Sometimes it's said to be true by knowledge that is true by definition. Examples would be like this: all bachelors are unmarried males. Now, you don't have to know any bachelors to know that bachelors are defined as unmarried males. Or take this statement: if I sat in class 4 days, I sat in class at least 3 days. All you have to know is the meaning of 4, to know that that you sat in class 3 days, or all triangles have 3 sides. Now, the philosophical school of thought that emphasizes a priori knowledge as a source of knowledge is called rationalism. Rationalism. Write that down, because I'm now going to give you a definition of rationalism that will appear on your final exam. Here's the definition. Rationalism is the position that holds that knowledge is not primarily derived from experiences, but is acquired a priori through reason. So again, rationalism is the position that holds that knowledge is not primarily derived from experiences, but is acquired a priori through reason. So that's the first kind of knowledge that philosophy talks about predominantly. The second one is a posteriori knowledge. And a posteriori is 2 words. The first word is the letter A, and posteriori is spelled P-O-S-T-E-R-I-O-R-I. So write down the phrase a posteriori knowledge, because I'm about to give you a definition of it that will appear on your final exam. Here's the definition. A posteriori knowledge is knowledge that is acquired because of, in subsequent to, sense experience. Again, a posteriori knowledge is knowledge that is acquired because of, in subsequent to, sense experience. It's also called empirical knowledge. Examples are, for example, John is a bachelor. Now, you would have to know John in order to know that he's a bachelor. And you'd have to know that he's an unmarried male. Or take the statement, smoking causes cancer. The only way you know that is through the research and science that has been done to determine that smoking causes cancer. So it's something that was learned through experience. Or take the statement, the keys are on the table. To know that is to see the keys that are on the table. You have to know it experientially. Now, the philosophical school of thought that emphasizes a posteriori knowledge is called empiricism. And empiricism is spelled P-I-R-I-C-I-S-M. So write down the word empiricism, because I'm now going to give you a definition of empiricism that will appear on your final exam. Empiricism is the position that holds knowledge is primarily acquired through sensory experience. So again, empiricism is the position that holds that knowledge is primarily acquired through sensory experience. Now, obviously, the use of perception through the five senses is paramount for empiricism. What we can say about both of these types of knowledge, of a priori and a posteriori knowledge, is that they make claims about knowing reality. External reality in the case of a posteriori knowledge, or knowledge of the external world. Internal reality in the case of a priori knowledge, knowledge of the truths of reason, what's internal to the mind. So the question now becomes, what is involved in knowing reality? And now what I want to talk about is the conditions for knowledge. Here's a statement that I don't want you to write down because it will appear on your final exam. Here's a statement. Traditionally, philosophy has defined knowledge as justified true belief. So here's the statement again. Traditionally, philosophy has defined knowledge as justified true belief. In other words, for anything to count as knowledge, it must meet these three conditions. First, it must be a belief. Secondly, it must be a justified belief. And thirdly, what is believed must be true. Now, let's talk about each one of these individually. First of all, it must be a belief, or something that someone affirms as being the case. Now, it's impossible to know something one doesn't believe is true. To say, for example, I know the keys are on the table, but I don't believe the keys are on the table, would be nonsense. It would be a contradiction. But notice the reverse is not the case. It is possible to believe that something is true, but not know that it's true. I can say without contradicting myself, I believe there is life on other planets, but I don't know there is life on other planets. The reason for the difference is because although belief is a necessary condition for knowledge, belief alone isn't sufficient to guarantee knowledge. The two other conditions must also apply. So, the second condition, justification. In addition to knowledge being a belief, it also must be a justified belief. In other words, there must be justification for having the belief. Justification means that there must be sufficient reason or evidence to think what the belief claims is trustworthy. Now, there can be many sources for justification. For example, you saw it. I know the keys are on the table because I can see them. You and many others saw it might be a reason or justification. You sensed it in some way that others can verify, like smelling an odor. There are many reliable divergent sources of evidence making the same claim, as, for example, in a historical claim. You can prove it through experimentation, is another example. Or it's correct logically, like A equals A. But it's possible to be justified in believing something is true, but it turns out not to be true. For example, you could say, I know the keys are on the table because I placed them there only 2 minutes ago, only to discover that someone had moved the keys during that time period. In other words, although you were justified in trusting your belief was nevertheless not true. So therefore, many philosophers believe you have to have the third condition for knowledge, and that's truth. So in addition to a belief being justified, it must also meet the condition of being true in order to be knowledge. After all, it makes no sense to say that one knows and can trust a claim that is false. So a justified belief must also be true. That is, reality must accurately reflect and verify what the justified belief claims. Now, justification, the notion of justified true belief, these conditions for knowledge, have been around since Plato. And when we talk about Plato's epistemology, we'll talk about that a little further. And they were around for many years, many years, I should say, until someone around in the 1960s by the name of Edmund Gettier, his last name is spelled Gettier, came along. And he presented what's been called the Gettier problem. And he asked the question, is justified true belief really sufficient to guarantee knowledge? And he gave various thought experiments to cast doubt on that claim that justified true belief was sufficient to guarantee knowledge. He mentioned the case of a hypothetical case of someone named Henry driving in a rural area in which there are dozens of barn facades. Now, a barn facade is just the front of the barn. There's no side or no back or interior. It's just the front part of the barn. So Henry's driving along, seeing, and he's lost in thought. And he just barely sees these barn facades, thinking that they're barns. And he's just driving along. But one structure, say the 33rd one that he passes, is actually a complete barn. Now imagine that Henry is lost in thought as he drives and doesn't notice the many barn facades. But he does happen to look up at the 33rd structure and sees the barn. Gettier asks, is he entitled to say, I know I see a barn? Now, he's justified in saying it because he sees it. And it also happens to be true because the 33rd structure is a complete barn. But Gettier asks, isn't it just a matter of luck that he got this belief right, since he could have had the same belief about the 32 previous structures and been wrong? In other words, does a lucky, justified, true belief rise to the level of knowledge? Is knowledge dependent on something as flimsy as luck? Now, when I say I see the keys on the table and I'm actually mistaking something else for the keys, I can't say I know the keys are on the table. But when I actually see the keys on the table and say, I know the keys are on the table, do I really know this only because in that case I happened to be right? Another example Gettier uses is that of a man who believes his wife is being unfaithful to him. And the reason why he thinks this is because he sees these expenses being made fairly recently at a local hotel. And he thinks that his wife is meeting her lover at the local hotel. Now, little does he know that actually the wife is spending this money at the hotel because she's making purchases, because she intends to hold a surprise birthday party for her husband. But imagine it just happens to be true that his wife really is having an affair. So he has a justification for his belief that she's having an affair because he sees these expenses being paid out. And his belief happens to be true. She is having an affair. But his justification is shaky because she's not spending the money on the affair. But he has a justification. And this justification leads him to a true belief. So can he say, I know my wife is having an affair? On such a shaky and flimsy foundation? On such a shaky and flimsy justification, even though the belief is true? You see, what Gettier is raising and what we are raising now are questions about the possibility of any knowledge whatsoever. When we do that, we engage in a tradition of philosophy that's called skepticism. And skepticism is spelled, and you should write it down, Skepticism. Skepticism. I'm now going to give you a definition of skepticism that will appear on your final exam. Skepticism is the position that questions the reliability of all claims to knowledge. So skepticism, again, the definition, is the position that questions the reliability of all claims to knowledge, all of them. You can't know anything, the skeptic holds. You can't trust any claim to knowledge. You could be deceived by Descartes' demon, or you could be a brain in a vat, being stimulated to have these experiences that you're having right now and all of the experiences you have throughout your day and your lifetime. Or you could be like one of those persons in the Matrix who's actually in a vat, being stimulated to think that you're having an actual experience in the real world. Now you see, skepticism takes an absolute position on all knowledge claims. It doubts them all. It's not like another position called fallibilism, which is more moderately skeptical. I'm going to spell fallibilism for you, and you should write it down because I'm going to give you a definition of it that will appear on your final exam. Here's how you spell fallibilism. Fallibilism is spelled Fallibilism. Fallibilism. Here's the definition of fallibilism that will appear in your final exam. Fallibilism is the position that it's acceptable to rely on justified beliefs but to be open to either revise or abandon them later on when presented with new evidence. So again, fallibilism is the position that it's acceptable to rely on justified beliefs, but to be open to either revise or abandon them later on when presented with new beliefs. So fallibilism basically says, look for good evidence for what you believe. But be open to the possibility that some other evidence might come along and might change your belief. So you don't really rise quite to the level of knowledge in fallibilism or certainty, but you do have a good framework of beliefs that you can trust because the evidence seems to vindicate those beliefs. Thank you.